So let me begin by introducing Professor Till van Rahden, who is the Canada Research Chair in German and European Studies. He's been a visiting professor with us at the Albert Hirschman Centre on Democracy, which I direct here at the Graduate Institute, so he is no stranger to the Institute. Part of the book was written, or part of the arguments of the book were presented here and written after discussion with us. So in a sense, for us, the book is part of the process of discussions at the center. He is an expert on German history, on Jewish history, on German Jewish history. His major publication is the book called Jews and Other Germans, 2008, which has received a lot of attention because it's a major contribution not only to Jewish history but to modern European history. It's the first social and cultural history to probe the parameters of the integration of Jewish communities in the half century between the founding of the German Empire in 1871 and the early Weimar Republic. So it was awarded the Frankel Prize in Contemporary History as well as the Kommunalwissenschaftliche Premium for the best study in urban history, and has been very, very widely reviewed. This book of his has received very positive and very interesting reviews in the German press. I'm not going to go into Till's long career. We want to actually listen to him and discuss the book with him. What he does in the book is change the optic of looking at democracy. So he's making an argument to think about democracy in terms of practices of democracy in our everyday lives, looking at it as a way of life, as a form of life, how democratic subjects are formed, and how they, in what kinds of spaces do they interact with one another, rather than think of democracy as formed purely by institutions, political parties, rule of law, formal elections, all the usual ways in which democracy is studied. So he actually opens up with this book a very original way of thinking about not how democracy is established institutionally, but how does democracy survive, how does it reproduce itself, and how are how is a democratic habitus formed. And he's looking at institutions starting from the family, thinking of the family as, if you like, a cradle of democracy. So he has a wonderful chapter there on democratic fatherhood, of which maybe many of you are practicing members today, hopefully. And he is also thinking of, so I don't know the French equivalents of these. I'm half socialized in Germany, so Kitas, Wohngemeinschaften, so these are shared student residences. These are kindergartens which are not public kindergartens, but kindergartens formed by parents who have anti-authoritarian kindergartens in the 1970s and 80s for their children. So these are the kinds of new civic spaces that he's examining as, of course, social movements, the women's movement, being among them, looking at spaces which form democracy, carry it as a form of life, and he finally looks at why he thinks this is an endangered form of life, because what neoliberalism has done to these public spaces and their hollowing out is something which concerns him. So what the book does is it traces the history of what he calls, very nicely in German, he calls it a clumsy democracy, an awkward democracy, from its beginnings in West Germany after the war, after the ruins of the war. And through legal changes, but also through changes in everyday life and the practices of everyday life, towards what he now calls in German the Seichtum, so the shallowness of the hollowing out of public spaces where democratic practices can be practiced, where democracy can be lived. He is in conversation with my colleague, Mohammad-Mahmoud Ould, whom most of you probably know. He's professor of international history at the Graduate Institute. He's chair currently of the International History Department. Mahmoud is, could join the conversation from both angles. He's been working on state building and democratization in the Middle East, in North Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, but he's also an expert on political violence. So he's been looking at nationalism, racism, political violence, if you like, also the dangers, other dangers to democracy. I'm not going to tell you very much about his career and his many academic and non-academic distinguished positions which he has held. He's widely published on questions of transnational terrorism. His book on the ISIS, which I can recommend very, very strongly, A Theory of ISIS, Political Violence and the Transformation of the Global Order, published by Chicago Press in 2018. He's written before that on democratization in the 21st century, reviving transitology, and his book on the Al-Qaeda, Understanding Al-Qaeda, Changing War and Global Politics. In 2011, I think it's republished in an expanded edition. All of these are extremely important works dealing with questions of terrorism, transformation of warfare, but also of transitions to democracy and political liberalization. So that said, they're going to be in conversation with one another. I have no further role except to make sure that you get to ask your questions. Welcome to.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shalini. It's a bit intimidating for me to be on a podium with two scholars whose work I so admire. It's always a pleasure to come to the Graduate Institute. Albert Hirschman is someone whose work means the world to me, not just because his emphasis as a scholar has always been on self-subversion. So if I'm going to self-subvert my book today, I will have succeeded in my mission. But on another level, Hirschman always emphasized that at the heart of democracy is something that he called democratic experiences. And experiences is something that I find sort of underexplored in the context of democratic theory more generally. So before we start the conversation, Shalini had asked me to sort of give you a few ideas of what the book is about, since it is, in fact, in an esoteric language. So the first is a brief reflection about the mood that we are in. Over the past 15 years, we have moved from complacency and hubris with regard to liberal democracy to panic and despair. After the end of the Cold War, liberal democracy was taken for granted, and now it is in crisis. Citizens are distancing themselves from politics. The people's parties are losing members and votes. Twitter and Instagram are crowding out public debates and civility. Our conversations today mostly revolve around the question how democracies degenerate and die, to quote two very influential contributions to the debate. My aim today, and with the book, is to challenge this sense of despair that informs these conversations. Instead of obsessing about how democracies die, it might be more fruitful to explore what keeps them alive. The second point is about the primacy of democracy, which is a nod to a famous essay by Richard Rorty from 1990, The Primacy of Democracy over Philosophy. And it's also a primacy of democracy over political theory or democratic theory more generally. So in that sense, I see myself as somebody who owes a huge debt to John Dewey and the American pragmatist tradition. What I'd like about this tradition in political philosophy and democratic theory is that Dewey asked himself what philosophy can do for democracy, instead of saying what the philosophical foundations for democracy might be. So the book has no ambition to offer scientific certainties about democracy, whether as a system of government or as a way of life. What I hope to offer instead are scholarly arguments and stories, anecdotes that may prove useful as we reflect upon what keeps democracies alive. A series of eclectic close-ups on the history of the Federal Republic of Germany offer episodes to think about democracy as a way of life. The democratic miracle of post-war West Germany allows us to better understand the cultural and social basis of democracy in public controversies, in a democratic ethos, and most importantly, in everyday life. So then the next theme is democracy as a fragile way of life. Democracy all too often is seen as the default mode of government in a modern society. In fact, since 1918, democracy is often regarded as the only legitimate form of government. Even Stalin, Mussolini or Hitler, Franco or Saddam Hussein publicly advocated their regimes as a perfect variety of democracy. If we are all Democrats now, we have lost sight of a banality, namely that liberal democracy is inherently fragile, both as a system of government and as a way of life. Liberal democracy is more unlikely and more fragile than a monarchy or a dictatorship. There is no great share of probity necessary to support a monarchical or despotic government. Montesquieu noted in The Spirit of the Laws, first published in Geneva in 1748, the, quote, force of laws in one and the prince's arm in the other are sufficient to direct and maintain the whole, but in a popular state, ergo a republic, a democracy, one spring more is necessary, namely virtue, according to Montesquieu. Rousseau echoed such thoughts in The Social Contract, published in 1762. There is, quote, no government so subject to civil wars and intestine agitations as democratic or popular government. The Genevan philosopher argued, quote, because there is none which has so strong and continual a tendency to change to another form, or which demands more vigilance and courage for its maintenance as it is, end of quote. To highlight the inherent fragility of democracy allows us to draw attention to a set of simple questions. What are the cultural and social preconditions that make democracy possible? How can we strengthen and renew them? So forms and manners, not ethics and values, is the way to start thinking about this, in my view. How shall we best conceptualize such cultural and social foundations of liberal democracy? In the post-war German context, the most influential thinker to highlight this nexus between a moral order and liberal democracy is Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförde, whose work is now being translated into English over the past 5 or so years. The legal theorist famously noted that, and I quote, the liberal secular state lives on premises that it cannot itself guarantee, end of quote. A similar concern about secularism and its discontents is central to Charles Taylor's idea of the, quote, social imaginary. A democracy, my fellow Montrealer has argued, are in need of some form of moral consensus that is based not on abstract reasoning, but on lived experiences, social imaginaries, in other words, that allow citizens to embrace democratic principles such as solidarity and equality. According to Taylor, The concept refers, and I quote, to the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations, end of quote. No analysis of debates over forms, styles, and manners can match the subtlety of Böckenförde's legal reasoning or the brilliance of Taylor's arguments. And yet, I hope to suggest that Böckenförde's fears may prove to be exaggerated, and that Taylor's emphasis on a shared thick morality is more problematic than is usually assumed. Conversations about the role of form, style, and manners for democracy as a way of life may contribute to a more nuanced, subtle, and literally radical understanding of democratic foundations. To emphasize forms over substance is not only an odd way of putting into question contemporary anxieties about the moral basis of democracy. More importantly, questions of style and of form may help us in our attempts to square the multicultural circle and to navigate the tension between equality and difference. With this in mind, we can return to the question of democratic theory and revisit Böckenförde's fears and Taylor's emphasis on a shared thick morality. To privilege forms over substance is to emphasize rules, manners, and conventions over shared values and an ethical consensus. Against this background, we can perhaps begin to reconsider Böckenförde's famous dictum, and I quote the whole dictum: "The liberal secular state lives on premises that it cannot itself guarantee. On the one hand, it can subsist only if the freedom it consents to its citizens is regulated from within, inside the moral substance of individuals and of a homogeneous society. On the other hand, it is not able to guarantee these forces of inner regulation by itself without renouncing its liberalism," end of quote. If a genuinely pluralist liberalism that the book is advocating for is justified in putting moral incommensurabilities first, moral conflicts that cannot be resolved under any circumstances, the premises that Böckenförde calls our attention to cannot be found in the realm of ethics. A Republican constitution, as Immanuel Kant was the first to point out, would have to work not just for a nation of angels, as you probably all are, but also for a nation of devils. It might therefore be more fruitful to focus less on the civic virtues citizens hold, but to analyze instead how they articulate their ethical sentiments and fears in public. If liberal democracy is as much a way of life as a system of government, it would be short-sighted to focus on shared values and a common social imaginary. If we understand diversity as the inevitable effect of individual freedom, if we put questions of moral incommensurabilities and of cruelty at the heart of our understanding of democracy, we need to fret less about values or social imaginaries and instead explore which forms, styles, and aesthetics help stimulate, sustain, and revive democracy as a way of life. An emphasis on democracy as a way of life need not lead us to focus on questions of morality and norms, in other words. Instead, it invites us to analyze questions of form. Those who view cultural homogeneity as a prerequisite for liberal democracy overlook the fact that a specifically democratic form of civic cohesion emerges not from harmony, but from discord. Forms, not norms, are crucial here. Our ability to navigate moral dilemmas that we cannot solve but only navigate presupposes forms and conventions, rules and procedures that allow us to live with deep pluralism. Reflections on ways of life, questions of style and democratic spaces allows us to hone our feel for the cultural and social foundations of democracy, no matter how stable a democratic government and a constitutional order may seem, without ways of life that allow for and encourage democratic experiences and democratic experimentation, it will wither and perish. If, as Böckenförde emphasizes, liberal democracy requires that citizens also cultivate, shape, and renew a democratic ethos in everyday life, this presupposes a democratic commons, that is, cultural forms and social spaces that offer everyone the chance to experience freedom and equality in everyday life. In short, to explore democracy as a way of life is to focus less on how democracy works as a system of government, but to focus on what democracy feels like. And then finally, the question of rebuilding a democratic commons. A democratic way of life does not emerge out of thin air. It presupposes a democratic commons, a set of public spaces and institutions that allow for democratic experiences in everyday encounters between citizens. These include public squares and streets, public parks and swimming pools, municipal libraries and museums, kindergartens and playgrounds, youth centers and sports facilities, schools, and yes, even universities. In other words, all of these places are places that not only serve the greening of the city, public transportation, or education, and invite people to stay, but they offer, and I quote, a stage for social and political participation. Together, they offer spaces of democratic experiences, opportunities to experience freedom and equality in everyday life, and to cultivate a sense of what democracy feels like. The fact that schools, playgrounds, and parks have long been in poor condition in many places, especially in impoverished post-industrial cities, the fact that, to give you just one example, the municipal museum, such as the Lehmbruck Museum in Duisburg, which is a prime example of a post-industrial city, are restricting their opening hours for lack of money, and the fact that municipal libraries are reducing their range of services or closing branches is a more serious threat to liberal democracy than the rise of populist parties. Together, these public spaces, places, and public goods embody the idea of the common good. They create the framework that allows citizens to cultivate democracy as a way of life. Democracy thrives on political opposition, on ideological struggles, and on moral conflicts. But these conflicts can only develop their creative force if we preserve the democratic commons in which we can navigate conflicts and accept ambiguities. The more the signs of a crisis of democracy become apparent, the more evident it becomes how costly it is to cut the budget of those institutions and to neglect those public spaces and places that allow for democratic experiences that strengthen the civic sense of community and a culture of participation and peaceful discord. The hollowing out, the infirmity of the democratic commons is a threat to liberal democracy, first as a way of life, then also as a system of government. A democracy that no longer preserves these public goods and cultivates that preserve these public goods and cultivates a democratic way of life puts at peril its very social and cultural prerequisites. If we obsess about efficiency and performance, controlling and benchmarking in the public sphere, and privatize public goods because the invisible hand of the market leads to supposedly fairer solutions, we lose our keen sense of democracy as a way of life. Especially in cities, it becomes apparent. The leaner and more efficient the state, the more liberal democracy is endangered. Democracy as a system of government, but above all as a way of life, costs money. And without a strong, effective tax state, it is impossible to sustain it. More than other forms of rule, democracy needs spaces for democratic experiences, forums and forms of civic cooperation and discord, however inefficient such forms of unsocial sociability may be. If we do not want to give up the spaces of democratic experiences that enable us to fill the idea of a society of free and equal citizens with life and meaning, we can no longer afford the withering of our democratic commons and the loss of public goods. Without these spaces, democracy hangs in the air. It will wither and die, but it is for us to keep it. Thank you.
Thank you, Till. We turn to
Thank you, Shalini. Thank you, Till. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a pleasure being here with you this evening. It's very, very helpful. Thank you very much for everything you presented. Gives us a sense of the work. I hadn't had a chance to read it. Unfortunately, my German is non-existent, but I've really benefited from what you presented. For the sake of the debate, I will make ever so briefly, three points. The first one has to do with the notion of democracy itself. The second one will be about how spaces, realms, probably geographies, I would say, relate to this. And the third one is about the times we live in. So on the first question on democracy, and I would preface that by maybe a 0 point, which is that we have tended a lot in this conversation about democracy over the years and over the decades to kind of fetishize democracy. We have so many of our debates and discussions and research starts with a series of assumptions that democracy is something of a sort of sacred state, status, society, realm of things that could go wrong, that should be protected. And so we go into this logic, assuming not only that it has in places and at times been achieved, but that it is something that we can engage with as a recognizable, landed kind of project. And I would dispute that. In so many, as we just heard, so many histories littered with movements that in the name of democracy, in fact, performed quite non-democratically. Any number of your fascistic or authoritarian movements, again, as was mentioned, have used and abused the norm. But it's not just that, because that would confirm my, sort of rather go against the idea that I just expressed. It's more that, in fact, we can so often observe places where the very democratic nature of things, the order of it, say democracy, a formal republic, is itself performing systemically in eminently non-democratic ways. And I don't mean simply manifestations of injustice or poverty or class disparities or discrimination, but that the whole system itself is probably going against the very logic that is proclaiming on a day-in, day-out, constitutionally referring type of discussions. Now, it's absolutely true, and I fully agree, that the whole discussion about democracy has been hijacked by a presentation of the concept as essentially institution focused. And that has led us, in fact, astray. This much larger undertaking that this project is about, this conversation that is open-ended, that it will necessarily be evolving through ages, is not something that can be confined to a conversation which is almost technocratic at times about the institutions, their development, their establishment, their collapse, the impact of particular moments in history as such. One way I've been thinking about that is through an analogy with the novel. The novel as a form really sort of materializes quite late. Now, we're kind of used to it today as an accepted form of communication, of writing. But the novel is something that is very much related to 19th century bourgeoisie, in effect, and as it democratizes and is adopted, when you look at the dominant series of stories that it tells, they're very much stories about people's sort of psychological, couple, coming of age, issues that have to do with their becoming. And a whole medium as such becomes dominated by that. It's only well into the 20th century that you have new types of novels going against that structures, and in fact are considered as becoming almost critical of that, and then as we go into the postmodern form of it. But all the time our canon is that storytelling. Well, in many ways, our understanding of democracy is the nation-building moment where institutions need that fluid which the democracy is bringing, and so these states, coming out of a series of conflicts, post-Napoleonic Europe, basically gives us that. When in fact, democracy, I think, has very much to do with this intimacy that we just heard about, this way of life logic, this notion of having something of a series of relationships, of rapport, as they would say in French, of relationship to how one another relate in terms of consideration, in terms of civility, in terms of understanding of mores and all of those issues that are softer issues in the democracy discussions. Essentially constitution making, institution building, and so on and so forth, as we just said, I think has tended to hijack that. And that's problematic, and we need to move beyond that. And we need to move beyond that, I think, the more we go into the urgency of this, which is my third point. My second point, and so I absolutely agree that this needs to be developed further as a way of life, to be protected, nurtured, in fact, probably invented, as if you think the more about it, we don't necessarily have any obvious ways to start with this as such. I would, however, qualify the relationship, or rather the concept of having to leave aside or diminish the importance of ethics. For me, they are at the core of this discussion. I think that in the name of having a choreography of relationship that would allow us to essentially be more democratic, we run the risk at times of having this fetishization come back through the window and have people essentially speak the language of norms, which is different from what you're talking about in terms of democratic norms, but norms simply in and of themselves, while essentially becoming quite dismissive of other forms. Lack of understanding, intolerance in the name of tolerance is the better way that I could put it. We've seen this a lot in France recently, where the elevation of secularism, for instance, has become so militant in quarters that anything that is not aligned with that becomes suspect, becomes problematic, communautarism and whatnot. And I think ultimately what you're seeing is a form of elevation of a particular project in the context of a democracy. Ethics are central to this. They don't need to be institutionalized. That becomes dangerous. That leads to patria and nationalism and fascism and drifts. But the notion of ethics in the most noble sense, I think, is central to this project. And I think it does obviously have a place to occupy in anything that is going to become a way of life. I think of it as the glue of it. In a dialectic way. Ethics cannot be also sacralized in the manner that they become sort of something that becomes an ideology soon enough. My second point is critical of the West about its thinking about democracy and its provincial undertaking. It has fundamentally been a history where the understanding of democracy elsewhere is second fiddle to this. It's nice, we hear of it, over there in Asia, over there in Africa, Latin America, but the discussion really is a European discussion. And as a result of that, you have very little of a universal conversation about something which actually proclaims to be universal. Kant was mentioned. Kant, as it turns out, actually spent most of his life working on the racial question. He wrote quite a lot about this. And when you hear the writings that he has about the nobility of mind and thought and man, and what he has to do about certain types of people that are dismissed, and I will spare you the colorful language he uses, then you start thinking precisely about how this could be easily taken, decontextualized, in fact, dehistoricized, to be simply about a certain type of people, a certain conversation. And I would like to insist on this because it has become quite something of an issue that is coming back the more Europe is experiencing a crisis of democracy. You followed this discussion of the past couple of years, and as we go into that, the assumption is that at some point this was achieved and now it's degenerated as it is. I would dispute that, not only in terms of whether it was achieved in places in the West where injustices were all the time present. Can we speak of an American democracy sometime in the 60s and 70s when half the population is treated as subaltern? Can we speak of it still today as a democracy when fascistic tendencies are re-emerging? And this is the republic, and this is the democracy, constitutional, factually. So where do you draw the line? What actually are you taking into that assessment of it being a democracy? This is the central sort of assessment that we have to make when it comes to that. And it's not about one man, or it's not about one particular regime or moment. This is much more at the core of how do we assess the democracy of it. Still in that second segment, I think that there's a large part of this world, that's why it needs to be brought in this conversation, that is not having a conversation about democracy, but about democratization as a process, how to get to that, how to establish it, how to take essentially a status of things which is authoritarian in a quite straightforward manner and repressive, how to exit from it from something that would have these basic things that we take for granted elsewhere: accountability, representativity, norm setting in a collegial way, plurality of voices, respect of difference, all of those things that need to be somehow coded and integrated in a corpus, which usually is a constitutional process. That whole conversation around the world is extremely rich, diverse, happening live, one step forward, two steps back. It's highly irritating, this whole discussion about Arab Spring having failed. You hear that a lot in Europe. It hasn't failed. It's moving forward. It's a project. It has experienced conflict. It's going to be retaken. It's moving. It's a live, organic thing. And if you want to assess it as the fact that conflicts have materialized, so what's new? That's the history of the project of democracy around the world. And if you want to assess it as the survival of authoritarian regimes, again, what's new? That's also the story of it. But what you see there is a dynamic voice. In fact, most of the most vibrant democracy debates today are taking places in places like Tunisia, in places like Egypt, in places like Morocco, in places like Benin, Cameroon. You see those things where, and that conversation, I should say, frankly, is absolutely absent of a global conversation that we are supposedly having, and which tends to come back to us in a very incestuous manner. We speak the same language and the same references of those that we read, that we teach, and we share all the time. And it's simply shortchanging the concept of democracy. It's not doing a favor to the concept, which is much larger and which we can explore, as we just heard, in ways that can reinvent it. My final set of comments is about the urgency of this. And here I will say that I think that this whole conversation about democracy is at times too abstract. There's a sense of urgency to what we're living through today. There is a sense of degeneration is a term that I would absolutely agree with. There's a sense that what we're going through around the world now is a moment in history that we are passively observing, that we have been decrying, but that is slowly drifting into moments of history that we have known, and what we have known, what they gave us. And I think really, any time we have a conversation on democracy, it is incumbent upon us to remind ourselves, where are we today, in the early 2020s already, and what we have seen, we have been observing as dehumanization of women, of people of color, of minorities, of whole regions. This has been uttered, spoken at the highest levels, movements using that to fuel violence have materialized around the world. We look at this as a crisis here or a crisis there, but this is essentially our zeitgeist. And don't shoot the messenger and don't think this is alarmist. This is really what is the history that we have seen over the past couple of decades, if not centuries, that we speak from a certain distance vis-a-vis something euphemistically or rationalizing it, when soon enough we can wake up and find that those sitting around us are no longer tolerated in this room. Why we have seen this notion of a progress in a place like Germany is, I think, very much linked to the fact that the country was reconstituting itself in the period from the post-World War II to the early 90s, early 2000s. And quite logically, what you had there was a project that would essentially be focusing on this kind of centralized dynamics and bringing people together and building norms out of this. But then again, soon enough, that project having been achieved to some extent will bring that nation back to this larger debate that I started with, which is about what project are we having. So to think of today neo-Nazis movements coming back in Germany is absolutely logical in the larger context of a democracy, or white supremacist movements in the democracy of the United States, or right-wing movements in the Republic of France. And once the countries of the South that I mentioned land in a democratized phase, you will have equally those same type of proliferation, the plethora of voices. Tunisia is a perfect example. It is the most post-Arab Spring advanced country, and it gives 3,000 people to ISIS in terms of the plethora of possibilities that you would have in a system the more it opens in that sense, as opposed to us seeing the linearity that everyone in Tunisia post-2011 should be a liberal Democrat, rights respecting. No, it's opening a world of possibilities. And that's why ethics, as I mentioned, have to be somehow nurtured further and so on. So I think this notion of urgency for me is central. Shalini, I'm wrapping up on this. I would like to insist on the fact that the discussion on democracy has at times, over the past couple of decades, been quite, I think, not only dismissive of variety, as I mentioned, or paying lip service to it, but also by virtue of not considering the urgency of these things led us astray. A few years back, we welcomed next door in the auditorium a very important thinker on Todorov, the late Todorov, has been working a lot on these issues. And he had published at the time a very important book, which I highly recommend, Les ennemis intérieurs de la démocratie, the internal enemies of democracy. And he was already seeing all of the drifts that we're getting to now today in terms of what's happening around the world as a way of identifying not only the domination of structures, the corporate world, which we can come back to have a few things to say about that, but simply the fact that we do not see the elephant in the room, that is the very behavior. Democracy as a behavior, indeed, is something we should nurture, and it starts with the family. It goes beyond the family in the sense that communities are also interlinked by way of common values, as I said, uplifting ones, but certainly it is a matter of education. So the question of a certain intimacy, I would say, to that is central to this discussion. And with that, I thank you for your attention.